Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's a full Scottish today on Sunday the 12th of June. Now I'm going to discuss 5 of the main stories we've been looking at over the last week with our 2 guests today. In Glasgow, Sandra White is going to join us. I assume you're in Glasgow, Sandra, is that where you are today?
I am,
The West
thank
End.
you.
Okay, and also in Aberdeen, Kenny Anderson. So I'll introduce those guests in a bit more detail in a couple of minutes. First of all, I'm going to begin with the roundup of the latest from Ukraine. Day 109 of Putin's illegal invasion of his neighbour. And we hear, first of all, that the EU executive will this week make a recommendation on whether Ukraine should be given candidate status in the European Union. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said in a joint press conference with Volodymyr Zelensky yesterday during her surprise visit to Kyiv. And von der Leyen said, "We want to support Ukraine in its European journey." The family of a British man sentenced to death for fighting Russian forces have said they are devastated and called for urgent cooperation to secure his release. Sean Pinner, aged 48, received the death penalty along with fellow Briton Aidan Aslin in what the UK government has branded a sham sentencing. The pair were captured in April while fighting as part of the Ukrainian army to defend the southern port city of Mariupol against invading Russian troops. Rolls-Royce Germany has provided 2 superpower generators to Ukraine, the country's Minister of Health has announced on Saturday. In a statement, the Ministry of Health said one such generator is capable of providing the work not only of one building, but all the buildings if it's a large regional hospital. The US has announced that it will be boycotting the St. Petersburg International Forum that's set to take place in Russia later this month. We urge governments and companies to join our boycott and send a clear message that there's no business as usual while Russian forces brutalise Ukraine, said Ned Price, who's a US State Department spokesperson. Russia's military has set up another field hospital due to heavy casualties, Kyiv Independent reports. It's in the village of Shebkino in Russia's Belgorod Oblast, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Ukraine remains in control of the Azot chemical plant in Severodonetsk, where hundreds of civilians are sheltering. The region's governor has said Ukraine has said that about 800 people were hiding in several bomb shelters underneath the Azot plant, including 200 employees and 600 residents of Severodonetsk. A Russian-backed separatist claimed that 300 to 400 Ukrainian fighters were also trapped there. A United Nations commission arrived in Ukraine on yesterday, to investigate war crimes. Approximately 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed since Russia's invasion of the country in February, according to a military advisor to President Volodymyr Zelensky. The European Border and Coast Guard Agency says 2.5 million Ukrainians have returned there since the war started in February. The agency said about 5.5 million Ukrainians have fled to the EU since the war began. Russia is attempting to repeat the Holodomor, a deliberately induced famine in Soviet Ukraine from 1932 to 1933. That famine killed millions of people under the Soviet regime. Andrei Yermak, the head of the Office of Ukrainian President, has said. The armed forces of Ukraine have received new Starlink satellite communication systems from SpaceX. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry said that Starlinks would be used for intelligence missions. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is planning to visit Kyiv alongside President Emmanuel Macron of France and the Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi. The leaders want to meet Volodymyr Zelensky prior to the forthcoming G7 summit. So that's the latest updates from Ukraine, day 109. Before we move on, Sandra and Kenny, have you any comments on today's news?
Can I just say that obviously, our hearts go out to the people of Ukraine. I'm becoming increasingly worried about the mindset of Vladimir Putin and wanting to recreate a Russia which is long gone. And I also have concerns in regards to NATO non-involvement, I think, in this particular conflict. It's very, very sad, and it's also very worrying that this can happen. I know Estonia very well, and I do worry about the people in Estonia and other areas. But Estonia is particularly vulnerable having already been, and often actually get rid of the shackles of Russia. So I think it's something, unfortunately, that's going to be long ongoing, and my heart goes out to the people in Ukraine.
Yes, I'm afraid it doesn't look like this is going to be over anytime soon. People are having to settle down in Ukraine, I think, to a long war. I should have introduced you more formally, Sandra, so thanks for that. So, Sandra White was a member of the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament, and you did have some responsibilities for refugees, in fact, during your political career. Sandra represented the west of Glasgow in the Scottish Parliament and finally retired from politics. Well, you retired from Parliament anyway. I'm sure you're still active last May. Now, our
Yes,
other guest, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
you're still working on.
Yeah, I know. I did say something to somebody else a few weeks ago. You retired, and I was reproached for that. I've not retired. I'm still busy, but I've retired actually, and I've never been busier. Kenny, I think you're a young man. You're still working anyway. Kenny in Aberdeen is a construction consultant and businessman. So thanks for joining us. I'm just going to get straight on to the first topic, Kenny, and we'll see what you make of that. We're going over to America for our first story to talk about the March for Our Lives. This is part of the campaign to do something about gun law in America. Now, we've been hearing a number of people commenting since the last dreadful massacre, of course, since the shooting in Texas, which was about 2 weeks ago. I wonder, Kenny, do you think is this finally the turning point? Is this the point, looking at the November elections in America, is this a point where Democrats can come out saying, we're going to push for gun control, that's what we are standing for? Is there a chance that that could happen at last?
I'd love to say I was optimistic about it, but I was listening to a report from a US pollster this morning, and to be honest, I think even the more liberal Republicans are going to possibly be challenged before November, and the Democrats are under pressure in the opinion polls. So while there's a groundswell of people talking about it, and celebrities and many observers, I think the politicians' position is still very hard line, and the proposed revisions to gun law in America, they're fairly minimal, but the gun lobby seems to even resist that. Checking backgrounds of people, reducing the sales of automatic high-powered weapons. None of it seems to be on the table as far as the hardliners are concerned, which is very depressing.
Yes, Sandra. Yes, I accept what Kenny said that the president and other Democrats are indeed saying, well, let's at least have background checks. Let's at least make sure that people who are mentally unstable can't use a military assault weapon as soon as they turn the age 18. Surely that's the very least. But my question really is about why can't the Democrats turn this into a winning issue? We read last week that something like 81% of Americans are in favour of background checks. So why can't this be a winner for the Democrats?
I think it's the setup, obviously the American politics. Basically Biden can say what he likes, but he doesn't have the majority when it comes to the votes at the end of the Senate and the House of Representatives. So I think that's a big problem. And also the gun lobby is so huge, and they wish to protect their so-called rights. But, they protect their so-called rights, but not children's rights. And I think it's going to be a hard-fought battle, and pardon the pun in that respect, to get Americans to lay down their guns. And even, as Kenny already mentioned about the background checks, they're basically common sense. And yet most Americans, although you mentioned as well there about 80% wanting some form of gun control, but that 80% doesn't seem to have the power to push that forward. And that is a big worry. I had a friend who worked in Walmart in America, and she was on the stationery counter, and yet people could come in, buy stationery, cross over to another counter and buy guns with no checks whatsoever. She was horrified, but they would walk about quite openly with guns. It's going to take, unfortunately, I think, a lot of hard work and a long time to, make sure that Americans understand that these are not a right to be able to buy these automatic weapons that can basically kill people. It's a very bad situation there.
Yes, I was reading the other day that America isn't the only country to have large numbers of guns. Even in Europe, some countries like Finland, for example, have quite large numbers of weapons per members of the population. But in Finland, they're mainly hunting weapons and mainly held by people in the countryside. But in America, people who don't require guns, people in cities. Why does anyone in a city need a gun of any kind? But it's all about the power of the lobby, isn't it? Kenny, do you think can you see any way that it could be that the power of the gun lobby can be reduced? They seem to have a grip on the Republican Party, don't they?
They do, and there seems to be, according to a lot of the correspondence, a deep polarisation of the electorate, and they're entrenched in their views, whether they're a Democrat or whether they're a Republican. And of course, it's the rural areas, the rural Midwestern states that are very powerfully behind the gun lobby, and they're disproportionately represented in terms of population by the electoral college and the electoral system. So I just I could see northeast states of north of the USA changing the laws, but of course the power for this is held in Washington, and as Sandra says, the gun lobby is so powerful. I think it might be 5 to 10 years before any material difference can be made, and I think it probably is going to need civic society in America to stand up and be counted.
Yeah, the situation, of course, is about at the moment we're in mid-term period. I mean, people in America are talking about those November elections. So the situation is that the Democrats can get gun control through the House, but they're not able to get it through the Senate. That seems to be the stumbling block. Now, President Donald Trump has, of course, made his remarks a couple of weeks ago in Texas, saying that the situation in Uvalde shows that more good people need guns. That was the ex-president Trump's statement. Sandra, can you see that making any sense at all? It obviously makes sense to Republicans and to members of a gun lobby. If there's been a shooting, then obviously the people who were victims should have shot back. Now, how does that make any sense to rational people?
Nothing Trump says makes any sense, past or present, but it's no laughing matter. Well, you've heard what they've said. Basically, what they're saying is it's nothing to do with guns. It's people that need more money put into mental health services, etc. That's what they say, and we must train the teachers to be able to use guns properly. More police in schools, which becomes a very terrorising state. You look at Canada, which is just across the border. And Kerry's got a point there when he mentions about the various states. You've got to remember that America has its own laws for various states. So maybe that's the way forward, that individual states will, ban, not so much ban guns, I don't think they'd get to that point, but bring in the checks and balances there. And from there, if there's no shooting, cross fingers anyway, in these states, then other states may follow suit. So I think perhaps that's the only way that they could go to pass any laws. Individual states passing their laws, basically, like New York and in various states like that as well, who are very much against it. And they can look at the Canadian experience to give an example of the fact that they don't have guns in schools. So I think that's the only way to go forward. But I wouldn't listen to Donald Trump at all, similar to I wouldn't listen to Boris Johnson.
Okay, so that's obviously a story that's going to continue in America. So the reason it's in the press today is because of the MFOL, that's a March for Our Lives demonstration in Moscow, in Washington, D.C. Okay, so that's going to continue. Now let's move on to our next story, back to UK. We heard that yesterday that the High Court in London made a decision about the deportation of asylum seekers to Rwanda. That first flight, of course, is due to take off from an undisclosed location somewhere in England next Tuesday. So various groups, including a public service workers union, took an interdict. I think they call it not an interdict, it's an injunction in English law to try to stop that flight from taking off. So Mr. Justice Swift decided yesterday in the High Court London that the appeal fails, and so at the moment legally that flight will take off on Tuesday. Now, let me just go over, Sandra, I'll ask you first of all, what Mr. Justice Swift argued is, first of all, that he seems to be arguing that the claimant's fears about Rwanda are exaggerated. So the reason for the appeal was to say that various groups could actually find themselves not being looked after. Of course, people have been talking about LGBTQ plus people not having their rights respected in Rwanda. But Mr. Justice Swift feels that these fears are exaggerated. He also, in the second part of his ruling, he also said that I think he's saying the UK government has the right to bring in this policy because that's what they've been elected on, and asylum and refugee status is in the public interest. So that's what Mr. Justice Swift said. So let me ask you, first of all, does the Conservative government have the political right to bring this law and to bring this extraordinary measure into effect?
No, I don't think they have the right at all. Priti Patel says she brought in this particular piece of legislation to stop people smugglers and people traffickers. Well, you know, the biggest trafficker now is going to be the UK, basically. And to think that, you know, only last year a report about Rwanda by the British government said that it was not a stable place to be. There was lots of fighting. In fact, I think at the moment there is lots of small fighting going on in various areas of Rwanda. But, you know, imagine putting yourself in the position of someone who risks their life, sometimes coming from war-torn countries, which we, the UK and others, have been involved in, have been bombing these places. You come over, risk your life in a small boat. We've seen the child and others who have died in the sea. Come over in a small boat, and then you're taken to a detention centre, and then you're put on a flight to a country that you know nothing about, Uganda, with terrible human rights issues, and you say that you have a right to do that. I think it's despicable, it's inhuman, and it's unforgivable that anyone can say this is because it was in their manifesto. The only thing that was in the manifesto, and the only thing that got the Tories elected through Brexit, was basically racism, absolute against immigration. That's what it was all based on. And I just find it unbelievable and unforgivable. And I really would like to know which airline is actually taking these people there. And they turned around and said that young men, basically men, but now we find out it's families as well, unaccompanied young people being sent over there. How terrifying must that be? They've got no right whatsoever to turn around and say it was in their manifesto. We in Scotland didn't vote for the Tories, so what does it say about us? Once again, we have no say in it. Unfortunately, certain parts of England, which this is based on, and I just can't believe that any government would stoop so low as to take people and send them to a country that they know nothing about. And let's remember, lots of the people who come over the shores to Britain is because they speak English, because they have members there. Most of them are Iraqi, Syrians, Afghanis, who have family or contacts in the UK. Imagine if it was us being sent over there. I don't know how they can sleep at night. I just think it's an abomination. It's just disgraceful.
Yes, on the first point, yeah, who's carrying these people? Well, we don't know. Not surprisingly, the Home Office isn't saying what airline is going to be used, and they're also not saying what airport it's going to take off from. So at the moment, it looks like this flight will go. A couple of points on that, though. Some people have actually been individually removed from the passengers list. I read from Enver Solomon of Refugee Council, some were actually children who have been wrongly classified as adults, so they've managed to get some of them off. But there will be further appeals. It looks like there might be an appeal on Monday. But other appeals, Mr. Justice Swift said, are expected to take several months. So it's obviously, Kenny, does it look like this is the case where Priti Patel's got to get that plane in the air and then the thing becomes a fact? Because you don't usually, the law doesn't usually move quick enough to stop something like that happening next Tuesday, does it?
Well, I hope that I think there is an appeal as of tomorrow, so hopefully that can put a halt to things. But I mean, this is like stepping back in to the 18th century. And I've also seen a lot of the Conservative politicians referring horribly to this policy as a solution in inverted commas, which just gives you a reminder of how appalling it is. I mean, I don't remember anything in the 2019 general election campaign mentioning refugees being moved to a third country. And Rwanda certainly didn't arise in that election debate. So I can't see that the Conservatives have got a mandate for this. I mean, one of the letters attacking Boris Johnson in advance of his vote of confidence was from one of the MPs from, I think, Herefordshire. And for a Conservative, it was a very eloquent letter. And he made reference to the whole Rwanda policy as just being appalling. And of course, we've got other high profile individuals who arguably don't have the right to involve themselves in politics, but nonetheless, there's religious figures. And a bit like the American gun law, I think civic society has to stand up to its full height, because the politicians just throw brickbats at each other. But, church leaders, other community leaders. I saw in London there was a Glasgow-style protest stopping the Home Office, removing somebody from their home. I think action like that on the street is very effective and is quite a powerful image to sway public opinion against this sort of thing.
Yes, that's right. You're referring to the demonstration, I think last year in the south side of Glasgow to prevent two individuals being deported and lifted by the Home Office, and also something like that happened in Edinburgh a few weeks ago. And this is for the first time a similar kind of community protest took place in London. But you raise the point of civil society. Now, the reason we're discussing this today is because Prince Charles, of course, was in the paper during the week, in the papers, saying that he finds this situation appalling. Now, it's interesting why that came out. Of course, Prince Charles does not take part in politics. In fact, Clarence House, his official residence, has said that he remains politically neutral because obviously he will be King Charles sometime in the next couple of years. So, Sandra, what do you think is Charles's issue? Do you think he meant this leak to come out? He is, of course, going to be in Rwanda in a couple of weeks. The Commonwealth meeting is from the 20th to the 26th in Kigali. Do you think this is maybe him preparing the ground for that meeting?
Well, you never know if you're hearing the proper news, if it's fake news or not, or if it's conveniently leaked out. And you mentioned, Prince Charles and the royal family don't involve themselves in politics, but they certainly do. They did, just say the Queen's speech by continually saying that we are a united kingdom and basically we must stick together, etc., etc., which was obviously a reference to the Scottish independence question. So I think they do involve themselves via the government, basically. I have no problem if he did say that. I have no problem. I think it shows that he has a conscience if he did say this, and I would hope that when he is in Rwanda, he would make a statement of some sort. But I very, very much doubt if he would. You've got someone here who, when we talk about people, civic society taking refugees, into the house, from Ukraine, etc. This family have got hundreds of rooms in their so-called houses and palaces. They never offered to take anybody in. They never offered to do anything for the people who are struggling. So I think I would just think, I'd leave it until I see what he says in Rwanda. I don't have a lot of faith in the monarchy, I must admit.
Yes, internationally, Kenya, I noticed that one of the issues that's been raised in Priti Patel justifying this policy is the role of the United Nations Refugee Council. It seems that in letters to the people who are going to be deported, Patel said that the United Nations was on board. So here today, the United Nations have said, no, we did not say that at all. So do you think international pressure is going to be important?
Yes, I do think international pressure. I mean, I think it's illegal from UN human rights legislation and European human rights legislation, and I just hope that Justice Swift and his comments on Thursday and Friday can be overruled in the appeal court. But I think if we can summon up as much political pressure, whether it's international, civic society, as I said, church leaders. I'm wary of welcoming comments from the royal family, because if it sets a precedent, then that can lead to all sorts of complications. I do think Prince Charles is one member of the royal family who has got a conscience to a degree, but the whole Jubilee thing last week was an extravagant embarrassment, in my opinion. I've no problem people celebrating the Queen's 70 years on the throne in their own way, but the lavish spectacle was in the face of the cost of living crisis. So I'm drifting off subject, but I do worry about the precedent of involving the royal family. But I would welcome international condemnation, religious condemnation, and other community leaders.
Right, so let's move on to the next discussion. The start of the week, of course, last week saw the long-awaited no confidence vote on Prime Minister Johnson. So the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, of course, was triumphant, wasn't he, in that vote? I think he won the no confidence vote by something like 211 votes to 148. A decisive victory. Well, first of all, let me go to Sandra White on that. So he won fair and square, and he moves on. Let me just quote Boris Johnson. He did say that now nothing and no one will stop him. So it's firing on all four cylinders in the Johnson campaign. Would you agree?
No, if you had 40% of your backbenchers mostly against you, I think you're on pretty sticky wicket in that respect. And you've got to remember that he's ensured that most of the MPs who support him are all in positions as ministers, advisors to this, that, and the other, basically on the payroll of Johnson as well as being an MP. So I think he's in a very sticky wicket. He's bluffing it out. Personally, I don't think he cares. I just think he's a buffoon as far as I'm concerned. He's a laughing stock throughout Europe, throughout the world. They don't believe anything he says. When you look at the international papers, you'll see exactly what they think of Boris Johnson and obviously what's happened to the UK, hence with him in power. So I would be very worried. I don't think he'll last. Obviously, you've got the two by-elections, 24th, 25th of June. We'll see what happens then. If he loses these, then all of these other ones who were elected, particularly in the red seats, i.e. the Labour ones, who went over to Tory, I think they'll be very, very worried that come an election, they will lose their seats. And I think the pressure is on you, if you believe what you've said here in the papers, right enough, the pressure is on. They're working towards trying to oust him as we speak just now. It won't last, but he will bluff it out because the man has got no conscience whatsoever. I think he's a sociopath, basically, no conscience whatsoever. And to rule over a country where the GDP, is falling, we can't even rely on sterling. It's the worst it's ever been, and you're second to Russia in that particular aspect of your finances. And Kenny, being a businessman, will know more about that than I do. He won't last. Boris Johnson won't be here. I think he'll be gone before Christmas.
Well, of course, the next test, as you pointed out, Sandra, is the by-election. I think the first one's the Wakefield by-election, that's the 23rd, and then the other one is down in the southwest of England. So those are both Tory seats. Now, from what I hear today, in fact, the Labour really ought to win Wakefield. They are, according to an opinion poll last week, something like 20 points ahead. So that really is Keir Starmer's to lose. I'll move to you, Kenny. The situation, of course, in Wakefield is that the previous MP had to resign because he's a criminal. In fact, he is doing 18 months in jail for sex offences. So really, if Labour can't win that one, they really ought to give up. But the polls today suggest that Keir Starmer's not doing well at all. In fact, in spite of Johnson's lack of popularity, he's on minus 27. Still, more people think he's suitable Prime Minister material than Keir Starmer. So do you think that at the end of this year, Keir Starmer's still going to be running the Labour Party?
I don't know. I mean, I find him very wooden, and time again, he's had the opportunity at the dispatch box to strike something of a killer blow, and he's spurned the opportunity. In fact, Ian Blackford has been far more capable and eloquent when it comes to his questions at the dispatch box. I think Keir Starmer is probably a capable guy, but he just comes across as wooden. He's not charismatic. He doesn't seem to be able to think on his feet. He seems to work to a set script, which is in direct contrast to the criminal liar that Boris Johnson is, who just lies ad nauseum. He was speaking in Blackpool about his house building record in London, and he just issued a stack of lies. It was fact checked afterwards, and it was lie after lie after lie and distortion of the truth. And Johnson's got this ability, if he's in trouble with something, to look over here, look over there, find something to distract people. Part of me thinks the whole Rwanda thing is just to distract people from the day-to-day issues, but I don't know that. But Starmer's just such a disappointment, and the Conservative Party, they lost 50 or 60 people who were eloquent opponents of Johnson, were deselected before the 2019 general election. But the Labour Party seems toothless as well. I mean, they've got a couple of female frontbench spokespeople, Jess Phillips and Angela Rayner, who are very, very good. But the fear is they turn off Middle England in terms of voting. So there is a major concern. I mean, in terms of Scotland, we know what we have to do. We have to become independent. We have to take control of our own matters, so that we can move forward, and then we can observe the politics of England in the same way as we observe the politics of Spain or France or Denmark or some other country.
Yes, of course, we can be involved with the neighbours without necessarily sharing the same political system. But Sandra, do you think that Keir Starmer is the man? Is it? What would you say is Keir Starmer's strength? He's meant to be analytical. He's got a keen legal mind, but does he just not have that kind of X factor that makes people inspired by him?
I think he's insipid, and remember he's Sir Keir Starmer. I just think they're too closely related in their politics, the Labour Party in general, and I think they sold their soul to the devil trying to get elected down south, Middle England. And to me, they followed the Tony Blair line, basically leaned towards the right because they felt they had to move Middle England, and they left behind the people who put their faith in the Labour Party, who are struggling and just trying to make a living, trying to go on with their lives. But Keir Starmer to me is so insipid. The Labour Party has lost its way just to woo Middle England, and that's why Scotland has to go its own way. It has to become independent. It's an entirely different way of looking at things. But I think we touched a point there, both of you, I think is really important. We need to get rid of a sort of a chip that Scotland's got on its shoulder at times and start to look at grown-up politics, look at England as a separate country, which it is, but not with a chip on your shoulder, what we can do for Scotland, and look at it in an ambitious way, and then I think we'll be able to move on. But Keir Starmer, I mean, you mentioned about him, being a lawyer, etc., etc. I've met quite a lot of people who are QCs and lawyers, and I can tell you that sometimes they're so embroiled in the system that they can't see the wood for the trees, and I think that's where Keir Starmer is.
Yeah, too much of a detail, man. Just before we move on, let's bring this home to Scotland. Anna Sarwar has of course recently been saying that there will be a general election, probably 2024. Our man is Keir Starmer. Vote for Anas. I'm Keir Starmer's number one supporter here, and it's only a vote for the usual stuff. If you want to vote out the Tories, you have to vote Labour. Now that's questionable whether that's actually true in Scotland, with one MP compared to SNP's 42, I think. But does that mean that Anas is maybe on a sticky wicket himself if it turns out that Starmer isn't actually going to make any headway? Kenny, what do you think of that? Is it likely that they could both be buried?
Well, I mean, Anas Sarwar just seems to be trying to make himself as popular as possible, but without any meaningful commentary on policy or strategy. And Starmer, similarly, doesn't seem to have any policies or strategy to catch the imagination. they sound tired already and haven't been in government for however many years. I mean, I can't remember the exact statistics, but I don't think it would have made any difference if Scotland had voted in its entirety for the Labour Party. It wouldn't have prevented Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister. It wouldn't have prevented Margaret Thatcher on all those occasions. If Scotland did pretty well vote predominantly Labour in those days. But yeah, they're not offering anything that strikes at the imagination to make things different.
Yes, the vision thing. Okay, so we'll move on a minute. So that was the story that this week that Prime Minister Boris Johnson intends to soldier on in spite of a fairly substantial vote against him by his own backbenchers. But the next big political test is at the end of this month, 23rd of this month, when there will be two by-elections in Conservative seats. So Johnson's position's by no means secure. So we're going to move on to a very linked story, I think, Kenny and Sandra, which is the economic crisis in the UK, because that's increasingly going to be the background, isn't it? Prime Minister Johnson faces an extremely difficult summer. We already know that inflation, of course, is shooting up. It may well peak at double figures and probably settle down to 8 or 9%. So that's inflation that we haven't seen for something like 30 years. On top of that, we've heard this week that the UK economy's growth will be practically the bottom of the G20, the 20 top economies of the world. There's only one which is worse than the UK in growth this year. Guess which country that is. And on top of that, we've also got, of course, a series of public sector strikes coming up. So it looks like Johnson is going to be facing extremely turbulent waters at home. Kenny, do you think this is going to be a situation that's is going to make the UK government even more unpopular as the economic crisis bites?
I think so. I think that will turn things, but of course people have got to have something to grasp as an alternative. But I mean, the fuel situation seems to be out of control, and yet in 2011 and 2014, the price of oil was the same as it is now, approximately, but the price of petrol and diesel wasn't as high as it is now. Equally, the price of gas went up 600%, but it's dropped back now to about 250% of its previous stable amount. So I'm not quite sure why we're seeing the huge prices in terms of energy jumps, Ofgem seeming capable of regulating the energy market, and price at the pumps seems to be falsely high. And these are some of the main drivers of inflation, because everything is fuel dependent for delivery of food, for production of food, for distribution of all products. The other aspect of it is that the Chancellor and the Treasury are taking a huge cut because the duty on fuel and the VAT on fuel accelerates with the base price. So they're taking a huge leap. I mean, while consumption might have gone down marginally because people are being more careful about fuel purchase, the Treasury is still making a huge amount of money, and yet there's no announcement as to what could be done to ease the situation. I mean, the 5p drop in the duty was just swallowed up by retailers, and I don't think the forecourt retailers are profiteering. I think the oil refineries are profiteering. I think a lot of the distributors are profiteering, and obviously production is making massive profits, which are going to be subject to potentially a windfall tax. But these multinational oil companies are very, very clever at moving things around in an attempt to ensure that they don't pay the tax.
Right, I'm afraid that link's just frozen. We'll come back to Kenny in a minute. Okay, Sandra, Kenny raised a very interesting point there. I think it's about, you might call it the structure of the energy market. It really looks like a market failure, isn't it? It's a good point that oil is very high now. North Sea oil is probably about $100 a barrel. Well, it was 10 years ago, but we didn't pay anything like the prices we're paying now. What do you think a Scottish government would do if we were an independent country? What kind of changes would you like to see to the oil market? Oil and gas.
The Scottish government has announced that, climate change, we would be, switching to various different forms of energy. So that's something that needs discussion and something that needs looked at. But what really, when you think about it, when we first, in 2014, we talked about the referendum, oil was running out, no oil, no anything at all, we would be poor. Now all of a sudden it's like gold dust and everybody wants it and they want to open up, which they have said up in, Aberdeen, Shetlands, etc., new oil fields. So once again, Scotland is being used to filter all of our energies down to England so that we can prop up the Westminster government. But when you look at as Kenny had mentioned, and he is the expert obviously in this particular aspect, the ones who are making the money, and I'm sure they're using it offshore, they're not paying the taxes here, as he already kind of alluded to, and we need to make sure that we bring in laws that anyone who is working in our country, either oil, gas, energy, electricity, etc., has to pay the full taxes. And I would assume that's what the Scottish Government would do. Now, the windfall tax sounds really good, but it's just a windfall, one tax. We should be taxing them all the time. Money should be not being stored away in offshore accounts, and we need to look at that in the Scottish Government. We're independent. We have to ensure that these people pay their taxes in Scotland into our treasury and not into the Cayman Islands or somewhere else. So to me, that would be the first step you would take to ensure that we're not robbed of any more riches that we actually do have. And when you hear this mantra from the Westminster government, this is what they said about people using offshore tax regimes, etc. Or they would just go somewhere else. They won't, come into their country. They won't invest in our country. That's a lot of nonsense because they do it fine in other countries. And I'd also like to point out when the Westminster government, Boris Johnson, they continually talk about, well, the reason that prices are rising so much is because of the Ukraine war, because they can't get their gas supplies, etc., from Russia, their energy supplies. Also, we need to remember that the UK only relies 5% on that, whereas in the European countries it's 40%, and yet there is France, who have capped their electricity charges 4%, and ours has went up 54%. So you need to look at these figures as well. And certainly, I really feel for the people who are really struggling. They can't heat, they can't eat. They're going to have to choose for these things. Can't heat their homes, can't eat. It's an absolute disgrace in a country that's so rich, but all they want to do is make sure the shareholders and the CEOs of these companies are the ones that get the money, and yet they don't even pay taxes in this country. And that's got to be stopped. And I would hope, I'm sure, when we become independent, that we will either nationalise or ensure that the monies that they get in tax is paid into this country.
Yes, so the offshoring, of course, is always an issue. And we reported during the week that although there is a windfall tax, but there is, in fact, an escape clause if North Sea investors promise to increase their investment in Northern gas. They can North Sea oil and gas. They can in fact offset that. In other words, they can have the tax reduced. Now that raises the question, of course, of the just transition, because as you say, Sandra, the difference between now and 10 years ago when the oil price was high is that there's now an alternative, right? We should be moving into the new technologies. Let's just move back to Kenny now. I'm going to move on. Kenny, I think you froze there. We've got you back now. I can see you moving. Right, we're going to move on to a question of pay because that's obviously the issue that's coming up right now with various public sector strikes. I read today that in the private sector, people who work for private companies are roughly enjoying wage increases of about 8.2%, which is roughly in line with inflation. But nurses in England are receiving less than 2%, which means, in fact, in real terms, they're going to be about £1,000 a year worse off. So really, we have a public sector squeeze, don't we? Private sector companies can put prices up, right, to some extent. They can say, we've got cost increases, so regrettably, we're going to have to put your price up. But a private sector company can raise money to pay a wage increase, but public sector can't. So we're stuck. So is the Scottish Government able to find any more money out of its budget to pay the public sector in Scotland, or do we have to wait until Westminster increases their spending, and then Scotland gets the consequentials?
Well, I mean, it has to be a balanced budget for Kate Forbes. She there's only certain elements that she can borrow on, and they're very, very limited. And raising income tax only applies to a very small proportion of her income to the Scottish government. So Scotland is hamstrung to that extent. So yes, the thing has to be balanced, and health already takes up such a large part of the Scottish annual budget that it's very hard to move more money to pay public sector workers in the health service, for example, more money without really damaging other parts of the budget settlement. So yes, we are dependent on the settlement. While we're part of the UK, we have to wait for Barnett consequentials. So that possibly means watching an industrial dispute unfold in England before a settlement is reached, paid, and then we'll get the Barnett consequentials. So it's very, very dislocated, very unsatisfactory, and yet another reason why we have to be in control of all aspects of the fiscal settlement by becoming independent.
Yes, again, Sandra, yeah, Kate Forbes does have to wait to hear what settlement she gets from Rishi Sunak. But of course, as I said earlier, private sector companies have some room for manoeuvre in putting prices up to pay for a wage increase. Also, Chancellor Sunak has some room for manoeuvre as well, because he can borrow, but the Scottish Government cannot do that. So, again, do you think that's part of the argument for independence, that if Scotland had the full financial levers, it would have a greater way of influencing these disputes coming up?
Yeah, I think it's something that's very difficult to get across to the general public, particularly the media, not yourselves, but most of the media who just don't report on these things. And you mentioned about borrowing powers, and that's absolutely right. If you and I and Kenny and others, if we want to borrow from the bank, we can do it, basically because we're grown up adults. And yet a country, which has a parliament can't borrow. So I mean, it's just ludicrous. And obviously, Kate Forbes she's a star. She's marvelous, but she's not a magician, and she's got to manage what she's got, and it's going to be very, very difficult. Now, obviously, you mentioned down in England 2% rise. We understand. Obviously, we know that in Scotland, the health service nurses got a 5% rise. So we're way ahead of that at that moment in time. But the consequentials is a huge issue. I mean, you take the news of the HS2, which is not going to come to Scotland. My understanding of consequentials is if there's a big project such as Crossrail, etc., then consequentials should come to Scotland from that as well. But we're still to see if we get any consequentials from that, even to use and prop up our budget. And I think that's a big problem. If we could just explain in simple terms, I'm assuming, to the general public that actually this is what happens. And I'm hoping the white paper that comes out, although it's been explained before, but it's never publicised widely, when that comes out, it will explain these issues. This is what Scotland gets. This is what they give to the Westminster government via taxes, etc. You've got to remember, taxes on oil, taxes on whisky, all of that stuff as well. It doesn't come to us, it goes to the Treasury. We need to explain that, and then the fact of the consequentials and the Barnett formula. So in my mind, it's got to be explained in simple terms to the general public of why we need to have independence. And like a normal country, we can borrow as well. So basically, to me, it's got to come forward from the Scottish Government. The consequentials, yes, we may need to use this, but we have to wait for England to give us some of it when we're actually giving them the money from our, energy, oil, etc., to prop up a failing Westminster system, whereas we could do so much more with the powers of what an ordinary country would have, or even a housewife or anybody at all that can borrow and we can't.
Well, perhaps that's one of the topics that's going to be raised in the Scottish Government's briefings on independence, which we'll turn to in a minute. But so that was on the story of the economic crisis in the UK and the measures that the UK may take. And the famous Barnett consequentials that Sandra and myself were talking about means that, roughly speaking, if there's an increase in spending in England, then the population share of that, something like 9%, will go to Kate Fobb's budget. But she has to wait to see what Chancellor Sunak's going to do before she can spend it, and she has to make assumptions on what he's going to spend next year. So that's what happens if you're not a fully independent country. So Sandra and Kenny, I'm going to move on to that final point now. I've just raised the aspect of the Scottish Government's recommendations and briefings on the advantages of independence. So we've heard this week, we've heard in yesterday's papers actually, that very soon, I think the start of next week, the Scottish Government intends to release the first of maybe two briefing documents. This is advice to the whole population and basically saying this is the advantage of independence in this area or in that area. Now, we haven't received any news from the Scottish Government of what topic is going to be in that first briefing, but from what we hear, there are maybe going to be two briefing documents published before the parliamentary term breaks up in the summer, which is the 1st of June. So we wait to hear what aspects are going to be covered in the first of these. So Kenny, what do you think is happening in the progress towards the referendum? Do you think this is, on the one hand, is this the start of a referendum campaign for 2023? Or on the other hand, is this the Scottish Government maybe testing the temperature, releasing a document and then seeing what the feedback is before they take the next careful step?
I think it's a mixture of both. I think the campaign, if we're having a referendum before the end of 2023, the campaign needs to start. Looking back on 2013 and 2014, it took a little while for the momentum to grow. I was very active in the independence campaign, and I had a set of evidence documents, everything from the OECD to quotations from leading business people. I was very active with Business for Scotland, and I had a pile of paper that was 10 or 11 inches deep, and at meetings I was able to go to the evidence. Takes a little while to build that level of knowledge, and I think there'll have to be briefings to the general public. I think there'll have to be briefings to normal campaigners like me that are possibly not active within political parties, so that when we're asked for our opinions, whether it's on radio, television, or at public hall meetings, we have a range of answers for the questions. I've got my own views on what those answers should be, but on average at public meetings, we were able to convert about 25% of the people from being either sitting on the fence to absolute no voters into yes voters. So yeah, we've got to get going, and sooner the better.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people just can't wait, including all of us here in Broadcasting Scotland. So, Sandra, what do you think are the big issues that could swing people from no to yes, that, as Kenny was saying, can be done?
It's something that obviously I've been thinking about in the group that I belong to in my branch as well. We discuss quite a lot, and we put up our ideas. Not being an MSP, and I have to correct you, I was the MSP for Glasgow Kelvin, because I just got a tweet to say not West of Scotland, Glasgow Kelvin. Basically, I was a constituency MSP for there. But the white paper, I'm not getting inside information, but yeah, they've certainly been speaking to various groups, focus groups, etc., as well. And I know they have discussed it with them amongst MSPs too, but I don't have any inside information in regards to that. Some of the big things obviously is going to be sterling, immigration I think is one as well, asylum, that type of thing too. But I do think it can't just be a paper that was just produced and this is a fait accompli, this is what we are talking about. I think the general public, civic society, and Business for Scotland have done such a great job during the referendum. I think they all have to be involved. Personally, what I would like to see now, I'm not an elected member, we're talking about sterling, there's work been ongoing, and I think it's high time it was ongoing. I don't think we should link ourselves to sterling. I mean, actually, you can link yourself to any currency. It doesn't have to be sterling. And the situation with sterling just now, which is basically going down the tubes, I don't think it's a good idea to do that in that respect. I know there's been lots of talk, and the First Minister has mentioned about the Queen still going to be, the head of state for Scotland. Personally, I'm in favour of a republic, and I think these things should be talked about as well. We should all have our ideas and our comments to put forward and what we actually want to go forward in. And the biggest thing for me when we're talking about independence and how we go forward is aspiration. For many, many years, you spoke about Anna Sawar earlier on in the Labour Party. They just, swing out the same old tune that Scotland needs to vote Labour to get rid of the Tories. But it's been said before, we've not had any Tories since 1955 in Scotland, even when we did vote Labour. So it's a nonsense, and we've got to make sure we have answers to that, basically, because that's what they're going to hit us with. We'll get the same old nonsense all the time. But for me, aspirations, to me, it should be the top line, the aspirations for our country, and then below that, how we reach the aspirations, how we give that to the people. So I look forward to the paper being produced, and I hope they do, basically it's not a fait accompli, it's put to the general public, as I said, in civic society, so that we can all feed into that. And I know that, before the 2014, it seemed such a long time. It was a wonderful time. It was absolutely fantastic. And I hope we have that real feel-good factor again. But I think a short, sharp run into the referendum is the best way. Because in my mind, what we did give the No campaign was enough time to continue with the lies that they put forward. I think this time we don't give them that. We don't give them that time. We put forward a positive message for an aspirational Scotland, and basically a short, sharp run into the referendum for me is better than a long run in. We can work behind the scenes, but I don't think a long run in would suit us at this particular time.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've been assuming myself it's something like September 24 or October 24, but say, why not September 23? 22, I mean, why not do it
just to come in
this
on
autumn?
one thing from 2014 that we've got to get away from was we spent an awful lot of time just rebutting the No campaign. I think we've got to be much more analytical to begin with, work out the chess moves that they're going to give so that we're ready with answers, so we're not just standing in front of a camera rebutting nonsense from Project Fear.
Yes, I was wondering when this document comes out, what the response is going to be. I remember in 2014, the UK Treasury produced something like 14 briefing documents on different aspects of the economy, but they didn't need to do 14 because they all had the same conclusion, which shows that it's not possible, Scotland can't do it. So that was obviously they were told to produce the answer.
The published papers, though, the hidden papers said we could.
Aye.
Came out later on.
But well, let's hope that we do have that kind of exciting debate that you talked about, Kenny. That's not. Do you think it should? Is there a danger? I'm wondering. It's more top down. Is that Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish government, says this is what it's going to be. This is the blueprint for Scotland. Is there a need for more participation to get people inspired?
Well, I think. As we've just said, we've got to have aspiration, we've got to have a vision, a positive vision, and we've got to be ready to use a cricket analogy, bat these fearful stories, Project Fear stories, right back with a positive answer, and being positive in every aspect of what we did was what took us from, I think, 28% starting point to 45% in the result. So if we're at 45% to 48% now, we've got to get up to 65% by referendum day, and we can do that by being positive. Positive.
That's right. Hope over fear. Right, I'd love to talk more, but we're looking at the clock. I better draw this to conclusion. So it's been smashing talking to Sandra White in the west of Glasgow, which is also in the west of Scotland.
Glasgow Kelvin.
Thank you, and Kenny in Aberdeen. So thanks both of you for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for watching. Can I just wind up by reminding everyone that we are a free to view service. We don't get any public funding, but we do get funding from our supporters. Thank you if you are one of our supporters. We are running a special fundraising this month, which is coming to an end in a few days. It's great that people have contributed, but we still need more money really just to keep this studio going. If you're in Glasgow, drop us a line. We can show you what we have here. This is an excellent studio. It's got great facilities, and if we had more money coming in, we'd be able to double and hopefully more increase. We'd love to be doing 24, we'd love to do 12 hours a day, maybe rolling news. That's what we plan to do. But we do have to get over this crisis at the moment. We don't have enough money to actually pay the bills right now. So if you can help by contributing, by looking at the fundraiser there on broadcastingscotland.scot, that would be great. But you can also help by passing on our programmes on your social media. It's excellent to have people like Sandra and Kenny coming to discuss the news, but please pass it on. Please make sure more folk are aware of what Broadcasting Scotland's doing. And this is a potential, we think, of being a Scotland independent broadcaster. But we do need your funding to keep going immediately. So thanks for helping, but please give us a fiver or a tenner a month, or if you can make a bigger donation for this immediate fundraiser, that really is necessary. Okay, so that's all from Hugh Stewart in Glasgow, from Sandra White in Glasgow, Kelvin, and from Kenny Anderson in Aberdeen. Thanks for joining us, and thank you for watching. I'll be back tomorrow. Bye.